At 0530 hours on June 4th, 1942, the world was still dark over the endless Pacific. The sea lay flat and black, stretching into infinity. From the small, isolated outpost of Midway Island, a lone aircraft engine broke the silence, a deep, steady rumble that echoed off the coral reefs. It was the sound of a PBY-5 Catalina, tail number 23P6, taxiing across the water like a patient beast preparing for a long hunt. Inside that flying boat sat a 24-year-old Navy pilot, Lieutenant Howard A.D. of Patrol Squadron 23. He had graduated from the Naval Academy just 3 years earlier, class of 1939. Now, on this morning, he was about to fly into history. A.D.'s mission was simple on paper: conduct a long-range reconnaissance patrol northwest of Midway. But every man on that island knew this was no ordinary mission. The Japanese fleet was coming. The only question was when and from where.
A.D.'s Catalina sat heavy on the water, its fuel tanks brimming with aviation gasoline, enough to keep it aloft for more than 20 hours. The plane wasn't designed for speed or combat. Its twin Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines could barely push it to 115 miles per hour. But it had something no other aircraft had: endurance. In the vast emptiness of the Pacific, where fleets could vanish into millions of square miles of ocean, endurance meant survival. It meant discovery. It meant the difference between ambushing and being ambushed. The Catalina's design was deceptively simple: a high parasol wing mounted above a boat-shaped fuselage supported by twin stabilizing floats. The structure was robust but ungainly, like a bird too large for its wings. Crews called it the Dumbo, sometimes affectionately, sometimes not. It was slow, lumbering, and vulnerable. Yet it was the Navy's only true long-range set of eyes. The PBY wasn't built to fight. It was built to find. A.D.'s crew consisted of 8 men: co-pilot Ensign Robert Swan, a calm, soft-spoken officer from Kansas; navigator Ensign George Graham; radio operator Harold Red Coe; flight engineer Chief Petty Officer Mike Delaney; and 3 gunners stationed in the waist blisters. They'd been together for months, flying endless patrols over nothing but water and sky. Days blurred into each other. Take off before dawn, fly 15 hours of monotonous ocean scanning, land after dark, sleep, then do it all again. The men had learned to function through exhaustion, boredom, and the gnawing ache of uncertainty. But today, something was different. For 3 days, Midway had been on full alert. Radio intelligence, the cryptographic miracle known as Station Hypo, under Commander Joseph Rochefort, had intercepted enough Japanese signals to suggest that a massive fleet was heading toward Midway, but no one knew their exact position. The entire defense plan hinged on one desperate gamble: find the enemy before they found the island. And so, every aircraft that could fly flew. At 0415 hours, A.D.'s Catalina lifted off the dark water, its engines straining as the hull broke free from the sea. The aircraft climbed slowly into the pre-dawn sky, leveling off at a modest altitude of 1,500 feet. The crew watched as Midway's twin atolls, Sand Island and Eastern Island, disappeared behind them, shrinking into the horizon. Ahead of them lay 700 miles of open ocean and uncertainty. Their assigned patrol sector was one of many radiating out from Midway like spokes of a wheel. A.D.'s covered a 45-degree arc toward the northwest, bearing 315 degrees. The plan was systematic: fly outward for several hours, turn 15 degrees, fly back, repeat. It was mathematical precision applied to chaos. a search grid spanning 22,000 square miles of open water.
And for most of the morning, there was nothing.
Just the hum of engines, the occasional crackle of the radio, and the endless blue of sea and sky merging at the horizon. But then, just as the first light of dawn began to paint the horizon, Ensign Swan leaned forward suddenly in his seat. "Smoke," he said quietly over the intercom. At first, it was only a smudge on the far edge of visibility. Faint columns of black rising against the pale orange of morning. But as minutes passed, the smudges grew clearer. Multiple columns, dozens, moving fast. 80's heart began to pound. "Turn toward it," he ordered calmly, though his voice carried a tremor of urgency. The Catalina banked slightly to port and descended to 1,000 feet. As they closed the distance, shapes began to emerge through the haze. Dark silhouettes slicing through the ocean. Then sunlight glinted off steel decks, and what they saw took their breath away. Carriers, not one, but two, flanked by battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers. It was the Kido Butai, the main strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the same fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the same fleet that had ravaged the Pacific, and now it was bearing down on Midway. The radio operator immediately began tapping out a message in short, clipped bursts, a contact report that would echo across the Pacific Command. 2 carriers and main body sighted, bearing 320 degrees, distance 180 miles from Midway, course 135 degrees, speed 25 knots. It was 0534 hours. That single message set in motion the Battle of Midway, the most decisive naval engagement of the Second World War. Aboard the USS Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher received the report at 0630 hours. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Admiral Raymond Spruance received it moments later. Within minutes, orders were being shouted, flight decks were cleared, and aircraft engines roared to life. The entire American Pacific Fleet began to turn, align, and prepare for a strike, all because one slow, vulnerable flying boat had found the enemy first. But Addy's work wasn't over. His orders were to maintain visual contact as long as possible, to update the fleet's position, course, and speed. It was a dangerous task. Already, the Japanese carriers below were launching their first combat air patrols. Tiny dots began to rise from their decks, Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, climbing rapidly toward the Catalina's altitude. Addy and his crew watched them climbing, closing the distance. They knew they had no chance in a fight. The PBY had no speed to outrun, no armor to withstand, and no agility to evade. Against the Zero, one of the most agile fighters of the war, the Catalina was little more than a lumbering target. Addy made a snap decision. He pushed the throttles forward and climbed into the nearest bank of clouds, disappearing from view just as the first Zeros reached their altitude. For the next 3 hours, the crew of 23 P6 played a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the clouds. They would dive briefly through breaks in the overcast, take quick visual bearings of the fleet below, relay updated positions over the radio, then climb back into the safety of the mist before the Japanese fighters could find them. The Zeros scoured the skies, frustrated and furious, but the Catalina was invisible in the shifting fog. By 8:30 hours, AD had completed 3 full updates tracking the Japanese task force as it moved southeast toward Midway. Finally, another PBY arrived to relieve him. His fuel was low, and his crew was exhausted. They had done their job, and done it perfectly. At 1,000 hours, AD brought his aircraft down in a perfect landing on Midway's lagoon.
As the engines wound down and the spray settled, the exhausted crew climbed out. Blinking in the bright sunlight, they had no idea that their sighting had just changed the course of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese fleet, once unseen and unstoppable, was now a target. By the time Lieutenant Adie's Catalina touched down at Midway, his report had already electrified every command center, from Pearl Harbor to the carrier decks of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The message had been short, clinical, and unadorned, but its implications were enormous. The Japanese main striking force had been found precisely where Admiral Nimitz's intelligence team had predicted it would be. For months, the U.S. Navy had been fighting blind. Now, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the enemy was exposed. On the island, the atmosphere changed instantly. Marines scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns. The mechanics fueled and armed every fighter and bomber they had. Pilots who had spent sleepless nights waiting for the alarm now sprinted toward their aircraft, hearts pounding. The control tower buzzed with coded transmissions and shouted confirmations. The Battle of Midway had begun, and all of it started because a handful of men in a slow, unarmored flying boat had seen smoke on the horizon. Meanwhile, far out at sea, the Japanese fleet advanced confidently. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand plan was unfolding. He believed the U.S. carriers would be drawn into a trap, lured toward Midway, ambushed by his vastly superior force. But Yamamoto's plan depended on one thing: surprise. And that element was now gone. Thanks to Adie's sighting, Admiral Nimitz and his task force commanders had the advantage of foreknowledge. The Americans knew where the Japanese were and could position their carriers accordingly. The hunters had become the hunted. But the price of that intelligence was high risk. Every PBY that took to the air that day flew into danger. Many of them never returned. Those aircraft were the unsung backbone of the Pacific War, slow, awkward, and almost always overlooked in the grand narratives of battles and aces. Yet without them, no bomber, no torpedo plane, no admiral would have known where to strike. For Adie and his men, the hours after returning to base were tense and surreal. The men of VP-23 gathered around their aircraft, checking the bullet holes in the fuselage, evidence of how close the Japanese fighters had come during their pursuit. Mechanics worked silently, refueling and rearming other PBYs as new orders crackled over the radio. Some crews were sent back out immediately to locate damaged Japanese vessels. Others were told to fly rescue standby, to find and recover downed American pilots once the attacks began. At 1300 hours, Adie himself climbed back into his Catalina for another patrol. The battle was raging now. American dive bombers from the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown were converging on the Japanese fleet. In the distance, towering plumes of smoke rose from burning ships. One after another, Japanese carriers were struck, their decks erupting in flame. By late afternoon, the once invincible Kido Butai lay crippled. 4 carriers destroyed, thousands of sailors lost, and Japan's offensive momentum shattered forever. None of it would have been possible without that first contact report. Historians often credit codebreakers, and rightly so, for cracking Japan's plans. But intelligence is useless without confirmation. The PBY patrols provided that confirmation. In an age before satellite reconnaissance, before radar networks and GPS, victory depended on human eyes, on men willing to fly into the void, scanning the endless ocean for the faintest trace of movement. That was the reality of patrol aviation. It wasn't glamorous, it was methodical, exhausting, and often thankless. But it was the foundation upon which every great naval victory was built. The PBY Catalina itself was a masterpiece of pragmatic design, born not from ambition, but necessity. In 1933, the U.S. Navy issued a requirement for a long-range patrol flying boat capable of covering the immense Pacific Ocean. Consolidated Aircraft answered with the XP-3Y1 prototype, which evolved into the production model known as the PBY. The name came from the Navy's system, P for patrol, B for bomber, Y for consolidated. It was unassuming, but over time, the name Catalina, after Santa Catalina Island in California, became synonymous with endurance. Each PBY was essentially a flying ship. The fuselage was built like a boat hull, allowing it to land and take off from open water. The broad, high-mounted wing housed enormous fuel tanks, giving it unmatched range, nearly 2,500 miles on a single load. It wasn't fast, it wasn't beautiful, but it could stay airborne longer than almost any aircraft of its time. And in the Pacific, range meant power. The interior was sparse but functional. Behind the cockpit sat a small compartment with bunks, a makeshift galley with a single hot plate, and even a small chemical toilet.
Rare luxuries for military aircraft. Missions could last more than 20 hours, so these small comforts mattered. Crews learned to survive on coffee, canned fruit, and Vienna sausages. The noise was deafening, the temperature extremes brutal, freezing at altitude, sweltering near the equator. Yet for many, the Catalina felt like home. They lived in it, fought in it, and sometimes died in it. After Midway, the PBY's legend grew quietly. While faster bombers and fighters captured headlines, the Catalina worked in silence, scouting, bombing, rescuing, and observing. It became the Swiss Army knife of the Pacific. By late 1942, a new chapter began, one that transformed the PBY from a patient scout into a deadly hunter. As the war dragged on and the Japanese dominated daylight skies, American pilots began flying their Catalinas at night. They painted their aircraft matte black, stripped them of excess weight, and flew low, hugging the waves to evade radar and visual detection. These became the Black Cats, nocturnal predators that stalked Japanese shipping under the cover of darkness. The tactics were improvised, but brutally effective. A black cat might fly just 50 feet above the water, guided only by moonlight and instinct. Crews learned to attack from unexpected directions, using island silhouettes to mask their approach. The Japanese, accustomed to daylight superiority, were caught off guard. Ships that thought themselves safe under cover of darkness suddenly found themselves under attack from unseen wings. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese sailors began calling the mysterious attackers Black Cats, unaware that was exactly what the Americans called them too. One Black Cat pilot, Lieutenant William Goff, led his crew on a daring night raid in February 1943. Flying through low clouds, they spotted a Japanese destroyer near Kolombangara Island. They crept in so low that the waves nearly touched their floats. At 800 yards, they released two 500-pound bombs. Both hit. The destroyer exploded, breaking apart in minutes. But the cost of such missions was steep. Flying low at night over an unlit ocean was deadly even without enemy fire. One wrong move, one cloud misjudged, and the aircraft would slam into the sea. Of the original Black Cat squadrons deployed to the Solomons, nearly half their aircraft were lost within 2 months, some to flak, many to weather or disorientation. Yet the results spoke for themselves. Dozens of Japanese ships were sunk or damaged, their supply routes disrupted, their morale shattered. For the first time, American aircrews owned the night. By 1943, the Catalina's versatility reached new heights. Beyond scouting and attack missions, it became a lifeline. PBYs began flying what came to be known as Dumbo missions, air-sea rescues for downed pilots and sailors. Whenever a major airstrike was planned, one or two Catalinas would orbit just beyond the battle area, watching for parachutes or oil slicks. When aircraft were shot down, those PBYs would swoop in, often under fire, to pull survivors from the water. It was grueling, dangerous work. Landing a flying boat on open ocean, especially under combat conditions, was a feat of skill and courage. The waves could be 10 feet high, the wind fierce, the visibility near zero, but the PBY was built for it. Its hull could take a beating, its pilots trained to judge wave patterns like seamen. Crews risked their lives again and again to save others. Many didn't make it back. One such hero was Lieutenant Nathan Gordon of VP-34.
On February 15, 1944, he landed his PBY in a harbor under Japanese fire to rescue downed American airmen. He made 3 separate landings, each time through smoke and gunfire, rescuing 15 men in total. For his actions, he received the Medal of Honor. But for every story like Gordon's, there were hundreds more untold, quiet acts of bravery in the vast, lonely Pacific. By the end of the war, Catalinas had rescued more than 2,000 airmen, each one a human life, plucked from the ocean by a crew that refused to give up. As 1943 turned into 1944, the PBY Catalina had become more than an aircraft. It was the eyes, ears, and sometimes the heart of the Allied war effort in the Pacific. It patrolled the emptiest stretches of ocean, places where no radar reached, no ships dared linger, and where the fate of fleets often turned on the sighting of a single shadow on the horizon. For most crews, there were no headlines, no victory parades, no front-page photos. Their stories were written in flight logs and salt-stained diaries, in terse entries like sighting, enemy convoy at 0345, attack initiated. But those reports guided submarines, destroyers, and aircraft carriers to their targets. In many ways, the Catalinas were the unseen link in the massive, coordinated ballet of modern naval warfare. Even as faster aircraft like the PB-4Y, Liberator, or PBM Mariner entered service, the Catalina refused to fade away.
Its ability to take off from lagoons, anchor in coves, and operate from makeshift bases gave it a kind of freedom that no land-based aircraft could match. Entire squadrons roamed from island to island, living off supply barges or small tenders that carried spare parts and fuel. These seaplane bases were often nothing more than tents on a beach. Crews built their own docks out of driftwood, filled sandbags for protection, and spent nights under mosquito nets listening to the distant thunder of naval guns. But from these humble outposts, they covered thousands of square miles of ocean, charting new routes, rescuing the lost, and shadowing Japanese convoys that tried to hide among the islands. By now, the Black Cats had become the stuff of legend. Entire squadrons operated exclusively at night, their aircraft painted a flat matte black that seemed to swallow the moonlight. They learned to use every trick, flying low and slow to evade radar, cutting engines to glide silently toward targets, and dropping flares to illuminate ships just before striking. On the darkest nights, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the soft rush of the wind over the wings. The crew would peer through the darkness, their eyes burning from exhaustion, searching for the faint glimmer of light on the water that betrayed a ship's position. One veteran, Lieutenant Commander Moon McCready, described it perfectly. You didn't see the ship until it was too late for both of you. Then you realized you were inside their world, low, black, invisible. You saw their searchlights stab the sky too late, and by then you were already on your attack run. The Black Cats struck at oil tankers, troop transports, and supply barges. They turned the once safe nighttime shipping lanes of the Japanese Empire into killing grounds. Between 1942 and 1944, they sank or damaged hundreds of vessels. The Japanese began referring to them in fearful whispers, believing they were guided by some supernatural power that allowed them to find ships in complete darkness. Yet, the secret wasn't magic. It was patience, discipline, and courage. Each attack required precise timing, coordination, and trust between every man on board. The navigator reading maps by red light, the bombardier leaning over the nose bubble to aim. A pilot holding the aircraft steady, just above the waves. Every move mattered. A mistake could mean clipping the water, catching a wingtip, and vanishing into the ocean without a trace. Life aboard a Catalina was grueling. The smell of oil, fuel, and sea salt soaked into everything. The roar of the engines was constant, a vibration that crawled through the bones. Crewmen often flew barefoot to feel the temperature change in the floor, an instinctive way to detect fuel leaks or overheating engines. Sleep came in snatches, meals in tin cans. During long patrols, they played cards on the floor, read tattered paperbacks, or just stared out the windows, watching endless miles of blue pass beneath them. It was monotonous until it wasn't. Moments of sudden violence shattered the calm, enemy fighters appearing out of nowhere, flak exploding in the night, or a call over the intercom. Oil pressure dropping. Port engine. That turned routine flights into desperate struggles for survival. And yet, despite the danger, many Catalina crews grew deeply attached to their aircraft. They gave them names: Miss Pickup, Night Raider, Snafu Snatchers. Some even painted shark mouths or pin-up girls on the nose. Small acts of defiance in an otherwise unforgiving war. Though most famous in the Pacific, the Catalina's reach extended across the world. In the Atlantic, British and Canadian crews flew Catalinas to hunt German U-boats. These were some of the most crucial and perilous missions of the entire war. U-boats often surfaced at night to recharge their batteries, believing they were safe under the cover of darkness. But Catalinas, equipped with radar and searchlights, could find them. One moment, the ocean was still and silent. The next, the sky erupted in blinding light as a PBY's ley light locked onto the submarine's deck. In seconds, the U-boat's crew scrambled to dive, but it was too late. Depth charges fell, detonating with a thunder that lifted the submarine from the sea. The ocean swallowed it whole. The Allies credited Catalinas with helping turn the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic, ensuring the vital convoys to Britain could continue. The Royal Air Force operated more than 700 Catalinas, while the Royal Canadian Air Force used them for Arctic patrols and rescue operations. In Australia, the RAAF used Catalinas for long-range reconnaissance, even mining Japanese harbors at night. The Soviet Union received dozens through Lend-Lease, using them to patrol the icy northern seas. Everywhere it flew, the Catalina adapted, the same design serving dozens of roles in dozens of theaters. It was an aircraft that transcended nationality, a tool for survival in the vastness of war. By late 1944, the Pacific War was shifting. Faster land-based aircraft and new long-range bombers began to take over patrol duties. But the PBYs were far from obsolete. They continued to serve as search and rescue aircraft. spotting survivors of naval battles and downed pilots after air raids on Japan. In one of its final wartime roles, the Catalina became the messenger of peace and tragedy alike. On August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, PBYs were among the first aircraft to fly over the ruined city to assess the devastation. Later that month, they were used to transport medical supplies and evacuate wounded prisoners of war from camps scattered across the Pacific. When the war ended, thousands of Catalinas were still in service. Some were scrapped, others were sold to civilian operators, converted into passenger aircraft, cargo haulers, or even luxury flying yachts. A few remained in military service for decades, used by the U.S. Navy and other nations well into the 1950s and beyond. Even today, some Catalinas still fly, restored by enthusiasts and museums. Their engines still roar, their hulls still kiss the water on takeoff, and their silhouettes still carry the weight of history. When the war was over, Howard 80 returned home quietly. He never saw himself as a hero. In interviews, he would downplay his famous sighting on June 3, 1942, saying only that he did what anyone else would have done. But historians would later agree his sighting was the spark that ignited the turning point of the Pacific War. The Catalina he flew that morning was eventually scrapped, its metal recycled, its story forgotten by most. Yet its legacy lived on. In every pilot saved from the sea, in every convoy protected, in every quiet moment where courage met patience and changed the course of history. The Catalina was never built to be glamorous. It was slow, ungainly, and outdated even before the war ended. But in its slowness lay endurance, in its awkwardness lay stability, and in the patience of its crews lay victory. They were the eyes that never blinked, the wings that never rested, the lifeline that stretched across an endless ocean. The story of the PBY Catalina is not about speed or firepower. It's about endurance, courage, and faith in the face of vast uncertainty. These men flew into the void, not to seek glory, but to make sure others had a chance to fight and live. Long after the last guns of World War II fell silent, the memory of their watch endured. In every searchlight beam, in every quiet dawn over the Pacific, you can still imagine the shadow of a Catalina, circling patiently, faithfully, endlessly. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the forgotten heroes of the skies, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a new story from the Second World War. We've got more untold missions coming, from the brave crews who fought in the air to the sailors who held the line at sea. Check out the next documentary right here on screen and discover how ordinary men flying ordinary machines changed the fate of history itself. Because in war, it's not always the fastest or the strongest who win. Sometimes, it's the ones who simply refuse to stop watching.